Salt Lake City wakes up to a dry cold with patches of old snow clinging to the runway edges. At Gate 14, passengers move quietly in a long line. They pull carry-on luggage and clutch paper boarding passes. Flight 3117 of Western Skyscraper Airlines is about to depart. The destination, Chicago. At the back of the line, almost no one notices a woman walking slowly and steadily. She wears a dark charcoal coat and carries an old leather shoulder bag worn by decades of use. She's in no hurry. She's not scrolling on her phone like everyone else. Her eyes calmly and carefully scan the departure board above. Her name is Judge Evelyn Monroe, 63 years old, a federal judge for the Northern District of Illinois. She just finished a key speech at a regional judicial conference titled Justice in a Divided Age. Now she's on her way home. Her quiet house is up north in Chicago. No cameras, no policy speeches, no applause, just silence. She dresses simply. No pearls, no high heels, just a turtleneck sweater, dark slacks and flat shoes. Her silver hair is neatly tied back, and her reading glasses sit low on her nose. To the casual observer, she could be a retired librarian or a grandmother visiting her grandkids. The gate agent calls for priority boarding. Evelyn steps forward, hands over. Her printed ticket, first-class seat 2A, and nods as the agent smiles and waves her through. The first-class cabin is small and quiet with blue leather seats, polished wood panels, and warm overhead lighting. She finds her window seat and sets her bag under the seat in front. She pulls out an old paperback novel and folds her coat across her lap. She doesn't glance around or join in. She opens to a page marked by an old receipt and begins reading. It's The Known World, a book she once cited in a ruling about land ownership for black families in rural Kentucky. The cabin gradually fills up. A white man in a navy jacket sits next to her. He glances once at her, then buries his face in his phone. Evelyn pays no mind, or if she does, she doesn't react. Then there's the click-clack of heels. A tall woman appears at the front of the cabin, blonde hair pinned neatly back, holding a clipboard. Her name tag reads Susan Hartley. Susan walks down the aisle checking her list. When she reaches the second row, she pauses. "Excuse me, ma'am," she says, polite but curt. "May I see your boarding pass?" Evelyn looks up a bit surprised. Of course, she replies, calm and steady. She reaches into her coat pocket, pulls out the paper ticket, and hands it to her. Susan glances at it, then at Evelyn, then back at the seat number. "This is a first-class seat," she says, her smile fading a little. "I know," Evelyn replies gently. Susan tilts her head. "Are you traveling alone?" "Is that so?" Susan hands back the ticket, but doesn't leave. Instead, she leans in slightly and lowers her voice. "There might be some confusion," she says. "This section is for premium customers only. I need you to come with me so we can resolve this issue." Evelyn blinked, unfazed. There was no mistake. That was her assigned seat. Susan didn't back down. Her hand lightly touched the edge of the seat, asserting authority with subtlety. There was someone Evelyn knew well after many years of sitting on the sidelines. No yelling, no force, just the quiet atmosphere of control, or so it seemed. She said, "I'll ask you to step to the back. We can handle this after takeoff." The man in the 2B seat glanced briefly, then looked down at his phone again. Evelyn closed her book. She didn't sigh. She didn't frown. She just folded the receipt between the pages, tucked it into her bag, and stood up. Susan stepped aside. No argument, no drama, just a quiet, deliberate yielding of space. As Evelyn walked down the aisle toward economy class, a few passengers looked up. Most quickly looked away. She heard a woman whisper to her companion in the fifth row, "Poor thing, maybe she got on the wrong flight." But Evelyn didn't flinch. She just gripped her bag strap a little tighter. Economy was cramped overhead, bins full. She found an empty window seat in the back of the plane. She sat down carefully, adjusted her purse, and rested her hands on her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't scowl. She reached into her bag, took out her phone, and opened a secure internal app, a judicial communication tool most people didn't even know existed. Her thumb moved slowly. Susan Hartley, Gate 14, Flight WS317. Unauthorized displacement. Verified? Reported. She hit send. Then she placed the phone face down on her lap and waited. The cabin noise was low but constant, like the background hum of a room pretending nothing had just happened. Somewhere ahead, a child cried softly before being soothed by a gentle shush from its mother. Overhead, bins slammed shut. Flight attendants moved quickly down the aisle, checking seat belts, smiling, performing their pre-flight routines. Evelyn Monroe sat in her new seat at the window in the rear row 33F, watching the runway disappear in the reflection of the small oval window. Her hands rested lightly on her lap fingers, loosely intertwined. Her breathing steady. To anyone passing by, she looked like any other passenger. Maybe a little older, maybe a little tired, but nothing remarkable overall. Inside there was quiet. Not numbness, not anger, not yet. It was more like a precise silence. The kind of lie formed over decades of listening to people under oath. Sitting for hours testifying without allowing your face to move. Considering life-changing decisions and never letting your heart outpace your mind. That's what this moment required. Not volume, not confrontation. Breathe in rhythm. Stay in control. She glanced down at her phone again. The screen went dark, but the message had been sent. That was certain. She didn't expect a reply. Evelyn rarely waited for permission to act. Besides, the recipient knew exactly what it meant. She slipped the phone into her jacket pocket and leaned back in her seat. The fabric was rougher than first class, the cushion thinner. Her knees almost touched the seat in front. She didn't mind. The cushion was thinner. Her knees almost touched the seat ahead. She didn't mind. The discomfort didn't come from the seat. It came from the way Susan Hartley looked at her. Not with malice, but with a practiced suspicion, like someone staring at a math problem where the numbers don't add up. The black woman, old leather bag, gray jacket, seat 2A. Something was off in her eyes. Evelyn had seen that look. Before, in the courtroom, sure, but also in restaurants, lobbies, hotels, even passing through security fences at federal buildings where her ID still read U.S. District Court. It never came with insults. It came with extra questions, hesitation, sharp little cuts that didn't bleed on the outside, but still made you wince. Still, Evelyn never argued about it. That wasn't her way. People expected loud resistance, anger, raised voices, maybe even tears. What they never expected was someone refusing to react. That was her strength. She looked out the window again. The airport was quiet. Luggage carts rolled by in the distance. A ground crew member waved toward the jet bridge. Time seemed to slow and settle over the cabin, the kind of strange pause that happens between boarding and takeoff. A shadow passed down her aisle. Another flight attendant. Younger black with warm brown eyes paused briefly as she walked by. "Ma'am, do you need anything?" she asked softly. Evelyn looked into her eyes. "No pity, just awareness." "No," Evelyn said calmly. "I'm fine." The attendant nodded once and continued down the aisle. That brief exchange, just 2 seconds, no more, something settled in her chest. Just enough to remind her she wasn't completely invisible. Up in first class, Susan Hartley poured sparkling water for a businessman from a coastal region who either didn't notice or pretended not to notice what had just happened. She still wore that smile, said those lines, but now her clipboard was gone, along with the confident step she'd had. He hadn't checked the manifest again. She didn't need to. The woman was finally gone. The incident was resolved. But of course it wasn't. Susan could feel it. The silence that followed Judge Monroe down. The aisle wasn't normal. It was the kind of silence that holds its shape like smoke in still air. She pushed the thought aside and rearranged the stack of napkins in the galley at row 33. Evelyn reached into her bag again this time, not for her phone, but for the book she had started reading. She flipped a Trang didn't really see those words. Instead, she thought about her father. Not because he had been through moments like this, though he had, but because of how he handled them. Don't match their energy, he often said. Match their discipline. That's how we win. He taught chemistry at a high school in Montgomery, Alabama for 38 years. He never raised his voice in class, never needed to. When someone talked back, he'd just stop. When they thought he was just the gatekeeper, he'd smile and ask, "What do you need to clear up?" Evelyn inherited that. Not just the calm, but the inner strength too. The plane gently shook as the doors closed and the crew began their final checks. The pilot's voice came through the intercom. "Good morning, everyone. Welcome aboard Western Skies Flight 31 heading to Chicago O'Hare. We expect clear skies and a flight time just under 3 hours. Please sit back, relax, and we'll be on our way shortly. A click. Everyone adjusted their seatbelts. Flight attendants walked down the aisle. Trays were securely locked. Books were open. Noise-canceling headphones went on. But Evelyn didn't move. She didn't reach for her drink. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just sat completely still, not stubborn, just calm. And if anyone in the cabin looked closely, they'd see what Susan Hartley missed. Silence didn't mean surrender. It was a warning that something was about to happen. Susan Hartley had been a flight attendant for 15 years. 15 years of early mornings and tight connections. 15 years filled with grumpy passengers, lost luggage, and a smile she wore like the metal wings on her jacket. She wasn't new. She wasn't inexperienced. She was the airline's reliable go-to, show up, get the job done, never late, never call in sick, know how to make a Bloody Mary without double-checking the bottles. And she knew how to read people. At least that's what she wanted to believe. The moment she saw the woman in seat 2A that morning, something felt off. This woman didn't look like the usual first-class passengers. Susan wouldn't say it outright, but there are patterns, expectations, and rhythms you learn after years in the air. Business travelers, retired executives, sophisticated leisure travelers, sometimes a uniformed soldier or a VIP guest. But this woman looked ordinary. A plain gray jacket, no designer label-worn shoes, an old leather bag, no rolling luggage like the others, just stuff you'd find at a thrift store. She wasn't new. She wasn't inexperienced. She was someone the airline trusted. She showed up, got the job done, never late, never called in sick, knew how to make a Bloody Mary without checking the bottle twice. And she could read people. At least that's what she wanted to believe. From the moment she saw the woman in seat 2A that morning, she felt something was off. This woman didn't look like your usual first-class passenger. Susan wouldn't say it outright. But after years in the air, you learn certain patterns, expectations, and rhythms. Business travelers, retired executives, sophisticated people who enjoy their entertainment, and sometimes a uniformed soldier or a VIP guest. But this woman looked ordinary. A plain gray jacket, no. Designer labels, worn shoes, an old leather bag, no rolling suitcase like the others. Just things you might find in a thrift store. She didn't act like a familiar first-class traveler. She acted like she was just passing through. So Susan did what came naturally. She asked to see her boarding pass. And even after the seat number matched, even after the woman calmly insisted it was correct, Susan still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was wrong. So she gave a gentle nudge, not aggressive, not rude. She never raised her voice. She kept her hands where they belonged, just a light push both figuratively and literally enough to encourage movement that would restore the natural order of things. That's what Susan thought. She didn't hate that woman. She didn't even feel annoyed. The issue was about maintaining standards, making sure first class stayed up to the quality expected. But now as she moved around the cabin, serving drinks and arranging bags, something else was overwhelming her worry. She kept replaying the moment when the woman stood up. No resistance, no attitude, just calm, deep calm. And somehow that silence said more than any shout ever could. Susan hated that kind of silence. It clung to her like static electricity. A few rows back in the galley, Emily Carter, one of the new flight attendants, was preparing the drink cart. She was still new, figuring out when to smile and when to step back, but even she had noticed the earlier tension. She glanced forward where Susan was moving briskly from row to row. Her walk was quick, tightly controlled, but her shoulders were a bit tense. Her eyes flicked around a little too fast. Emily recognized that look. It was the look of someone pretending everything was okay. She turned to James, another crew member, and whispered, "Was the situation in first class earlier normal?" James shrugged, sorting stir sticks into a tray. "Sometimes Susan's like that," he said silently. "She's serious. Unless that book just doesn't sit right with her." Emily frowned. "Her instincts—" James didn't answer. He just looked at her like, "Don't push this if you want training to go smoothly." Back in first class, Susan was smoothing out napkins that really didn't need smoothing. She checked the ice bin for the third time. She folded 2 blankets that were already perfect, but none of them fit quite right. She hated when things didn't go according to routine. It made her feel exposed. And that woman, whoever she was, had definitely broken the daily routine. Not by causing a scene, not by arguing, but by not reacting. That was what Susan kept thinking about most. 2 months ago, she'd gone through a similar moment. A young man in a hoodie in first class, wearing sneakers instead of loafers. He had a valid ticket too. She didn't say much, then just asked a few questions. He pulled out his phone, recorded the whole thing, and posted it online. She was called to HR, told to review her training and complete a sensitivity module. It was blown way out of proportion, but since then she felt like she was walking on thin ice. One wrong step, one viral clip, one accusation, and the wings she'd worn for 15 years could vanish in an instant. So when she saw the woman in seat 2A this morning, it wasn't just instinct, it was fear disguised as protocol. And now that fear was back, tapping her on the shoulder again. She tried to shake it off. She had checked. The passenger list no woman by that name in first class. Maybe it was a booking error. She was just trying to keep order. That's her job. Keep the flight smooth. Keep people in their assigned places. Those words replayed in her mind. This is my assigned seat. So calm, so sure, not defensive, not confused, not afraid. People don't say that unless they know something, unless they have power, real power. And Susan had a sinking feeling she'd misjudged not just the seating assignment. In the back of the plane, Evelyn sat still, unmoving. She no longer touched her book. Instead, she watched the sunlight sneaking along the edge of the window. Hands folded, eyes calm. But beneath that stillness, a slow awareness was stirring. She could feel the change happening. She didn't have to look at Susan to know she was worried. People, like Susan, eventually show their discomfort. They try to smile, they keep busy, they avoid certain rows. And Evelyn knew this. Power makes people anxious when they don't realize they have it. She'd spent her whole life stepping into rooms where she wasn't supposed to belong. Meeting rooms, conference halls, hotel lobbies, first-class cabins. She never had to prove herself with numbers, just with presence, and gifts didn't need permission. Susan walked down the aisle again, this time slower. A few passengers glanced up. A woman shifted in her seat. A man pulled his baseball cap lower. The atmosphere wasn't tense, but not comfortable either. Something had changed. And the thing was, nothing changed by shouting. Everything changed because of a look, a silence, a decision. Susan caught Emily's eyes. Their gazes met for a moment. Emily looked away. Susan did the same. The wooden cabin felt colder. In the cockpit, the pilot adjusted his headset. The phone on the plane softly rang. He reached over to grab it. The cabin was sealed. The door shut with a sharp hiss. The lock clicked faintly, echoing down the aisle. The overhead bins were closed, and the safety video started playing quietly on the built-in screens. Passengers settled into their seats for what they expected to be a smooth morning flight. Evelyn Monroe didn't move. She sat in 33F, straight-back seatbelt, fastened eyes calmly looking out the window. The engines hadn't started yet. There was still time. She didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but she knew for sure something would. She was certain of that. In the first-class galley, Susan Hartley stood with her arms crossed, watching the safety demonstration like it was window. The engine hadn't started yet. There was still time. She didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but she knew for sure something would. She was certain of that. Up in first class, Susan Hartley stood with her arms crossed, watching the safety demonstration like it was the first time she had ever seen it. Actually, she wasn't really watching. Her mind was somewhere else, replaying it for the 5th time. The image of the woman in 2A looking at her. Not with anger, not with confusion, but with certainty. That confused her more than anger did. She sat 3 rows back. Susan, a man in a gray jacket, was adjusting his laptop on the tray in front of him. He had just looked up when what happened earlier occurred. Like many other passengers, he chose indifference over involvement. But now he kept glancing down the aisle. Something was wrong. Then it happened. Another passenger also chose to stay indifferent instead of getting involved, but now he kept glancing down the aisle. Something was wrong. Then it happened. The intercom beeped and the captain's voice came through, calm and to the point. "Ms. Hartley, please come to the cockpit." Susan paused for half a second, just long enough to understand. The other flight attendants turned to look at her. One of them, James, raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Susan gave a polite smile and walked toward the cockpit. The curtains separating first class from the rest of the cabin swayed behind her as she disappeared from view. Just as she stepped into the cockpit, the door slammed shut behind her. Evelyn didn't need to see it to know things had started. She took a deep, slow, steady breath, then folded her hands on her lap. A passenger sitting across noticed the change in her demeanor. The way her shoulders shifted slightly like someone who had just taken a long breath underwater and finally surfaced. Inside the cockpit, Captain Darnold glanced at her, then gently tapped a clipboard. "Do you remember the passenger in seat 2A earlier?" he asked. Susan nodded cautiously. Yes, there was a mix-up with her seat assignment. "Have you verified the error?" he asked. "I checked the manifest." Susan replied a bit too quickly. "Her name isn't listed under first class." "Have you verified her ticket?" I glanced at it and it matches the seat. Susan hesitated. "Yes, but she didn't look at it." She paused. He didn't look. Susan's mouth was dry. She didn't seem to fit the usual profile of a first-class traveler. Captain Darnold blinked slowly, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the console. "That passenger," he said, "is Judge Evelyn Monroe, a federal judge for the Northern District of Illinois, currently presiding over a federal investigation involving 3 major defense contractors, one of which happens to own 18% of the parent company of this airline." Susan swallowed hard. The captain continued, "And she just sent a direct subpoena through judicial channels citing unlawful displacement." He said nothing more. He didn't threaten, but every word hit like a hammer. "I've been advised by the company's legal department to de-escalate immediately. We're returning to the gate while contacting FAA oversight." "We haven't taken off yet," Susan whispered in shock. "No," the captain said, "and we won't until this is resolved." Then he turned away. "You'll go back out there and apologize to her publicly. You'll offer to escort her back to first class." Susan stood there frozen. The cockpit was small, but suddenly it felt like a courtroom, and she was no longer in control. As she stepped out of the cockpit, the change in her. It was clear. Her posture was stiff, lips pressed tight. The curtain behind her dropped with a soft whisper, and suddenly the eyes of the first-class passengers all turned toward her. Even those who hadn't paid attention before sensed something. The atmosphere had shifted. She began taking long strides down the aisle. Her heels, once confident, now tapped the floor like a slow metronome counting down. Business-class passengers stopped in front of the screens. Some leaned slightly to the side, instinctively following her progress. A young couple whispered to each other, craning their necks as she passed. Susan reached Rowie. At front of 33, there she was, the woman she had sent away an hour earlier, now sitting upright, calm as ever, like a quiet storm in plain clothes. "Judge Monroe," she said quietly. Evelyn slowly turned her head. Yes, Susan bent down just enough to meet her eyes. "It seems there was a mistake. I'd like to escort you back to the assigned seat in first class." The words were rehearsed, fragile, barely fitting together. Evelyn didn't blink. "A mistake," Susan quickly nodded. "Her name wasn't showing up correctly on the passenger list, but we cleared it up." Evelyn kept staring at her. "I understand." She slowly picked up her bag. No rush, no urgency. She stood there with the air of someone not returning to a seat, but reclaiming what was always hers. Before stepping forward, she turned to Susan and said softly but clearly, "You said I don't belong there." Susan's face tensed. "I didn't mean you touched me," Evelyn continued, neither angry nor loud, just determined. A man sitting opposite paused mid-sip of his coffee. Susan took a deep breath. It was a gentle gesture. "I didn't." Evelyn said nothing more. She turned and began walking back toward the front of the plane, all eyes following her. Every row she passed fell silent. Some passengers looked down, others shifted uneasily. The man in seat 2B, who had said nothing before, sat up straight and stared at the floor. Susan dragged her feet behind Evelyn, carrying nothing. For the first time in 15 years, she was speechless. The aisle stretched out ahead like a quiet hallway, longer than it felt when Evelyn Monroe first stepped in an hour ago. But this time, she wasn't just moving through space. This was attention. Every seat she passed had someone watching. Some stared directly, others glanced sideways, pretending to be absorbed by their phones or magazines. But no one could ignore what they'd just witnessed. A woman silently humiliated, then quietly restored. Not by force, not by confrontation, but by a presence they hadn't expected to matter. And now as she returned, the weight of that silence pressed on every passenger like an invisible hand on their shoulder. No one spoke a word as she was taken away. Not when she was questioned, not when she was asked to move, not when she was touched. And now it was too late to pretend nothing had happened. The businessman in seat 2B, still beside her old seat, shifted uncomfortably as Evelyn approached. She glanced at him once, not coldly, not accusingly, just long enough to acknowledge his existence. That single look tightened his chest. He stood slightly to let her in. "Welcome back," he muttered. She nodded lightly. "Thank you." It wasn't gratitude, it was acknowledgement. He sat back down, fiddling with his seatbelt tray phone, anything to avoid looking into her eyes again. Susan Hartley, still 2 rows behind, looked like she was waiting for directions that never came. Apologies had been made, gestures had been taken, but the air wasn't clear yet. It still felt heavy. She turned and quietly walked toward the galley, her footsteps fading. The confidence she had before was peeling away layer by layer. She passed 2 passengers who had watched everything without blinking. One, a woman in her 50s, glanced at her, then shook her head and looked away. That look spoke louder than words. Returning to seat 2A, Evelyn sat down again. She neatly folded her jacket on her lap and tucked her bag under the seat. No drama, no grand gestures. This time she did the same, but the cabin had noticed. The man opposite her in seat 2C, late 60s, dressed neatly with a military service pin on his lapel, cleared his throat. "I've seen this happen before," he said quietly, trying not to draw attention. "Unfortunately," Evelyn turned to him confused. "Unfortunately," he stopped. "I mean, clearly there was a misunderstanding. I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Did you say anything when it happened?" He hesitated. "Oh, I didn't think it was my place." "Exactly." Evelyn nodded once. "I understand." And immediately she turned back toward the window. He said no more. In the galley, Susan leaned against the narrow counter, her hands trembling slightly as she held a stack of napkins. Emily Carter came in behind her, quietly checking inventory lists. She stopped noticing Susan's expression. "You okay?" Emily asked cautiously. Susan nodded too quickly. "Yes, I'm fine." Emily didn't press, but lingered. Finally, she said, "Was her ticket really wrong?" Susan didn't answer right away. "She didn't seem like she belonged here," she whispered. "I didn't want to take any chances. We've seen people sneak up front before." Emily frowned, but she still had a seat right and a federal ID. Susan stared in the galley. Susan leaned against the narrow counter, her hand trembling slightly as she held a stack of napkins that didn't need folding. Emily Carter came up behind her, quietly checking the inventory list. She stopped noticing the look on Susan's face. "You okay?" Emily asked cautiously. Susan nodded too quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine." Emily didn't push, but stayed a moment longer. Finally, she said, "Was her ticket really wrong?" Susan didn't answer right away. "She didn't seem like she belonged here," she whispered almost. They didn't want to take any chances. We had seen people sneaking forward before." Emily frowned. "But she still had a seat right and a federal ID." Susan stared down at her hands. "I just didn't look closely enough," she admitted. Emily said nothing. "That's the problem." She didn't say, "You messed up." She just stood there for a moment, then said, "It doesn't look good." Susan nodded slowly. "No," she said. "It really doesn't." Back in seat 2A, Evelyn wasn't reading. The book lay open on her lap, but her mind was elsewhere. The cabin felt quieter now, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that follows an alarm bell when everyone pretends not to hear it. She could feel it in the way the flight attendants moved, in the stiff movements of the passengers, and in how they accepted their drinks without making eye contact. No one knew what to say, so they said nothing at all. But silence isn't neutral. It tells its own story. It says, "I saw you push and I didn't stand up. That means I heard what she said and I followed through." This one means I didn't think it was my business until I knew who you were. The last one hurt me the most. Her phone vibrated softly in her jacket pocket. She discreetly pulled it out, shielding the screen from others. A message from her father. They had confirmed everything. Stay calm. The Federal Aviation Administration is increasing security checks. You don't need to take any further action. I'll handle the rest. She gave a weak smile. Not because she felt vindicated, but because the system she had helped uphold was finally taking responsibility in this moment. She didn't reply. There was nothing to say. In the row behind her, a young woman whispered to her companion, "Do you think she's someone important?" "I think so," he whispered back. Someone definitely picked the wrong person. At 35,000 feet above the ground, Evelyn Monroe stared out at the horizon, calm and steady. The reckoning had begun not through shouting, not through confrontation. It all started with a woman being kicked out of her home because of how she looked, and no one could explain why. That question hung heavy in the cabin without an answer, and it weighed on everyone. Why did we say nothing? And in that silence, Evelyn sat there, not small, not angry, not afraid, but unmistakably present. The plane fell silent again. But it wasn't the peace of calm. It was the kind of feeling that follows discomfort, the feeling that fills a room or cabin when people have seen too much and said too little. Evelyn Monroe sat back down in her seat, still as calm as before, except the energy around her had shifted. Passengers didn't talk to her, but they watched subtly, carefully, cautiously, as if even the air was holding its breath, unsure what would happen next. She didn't look at them and didn't need to. She had mastered the art of filling the room without reacting. That's what a judge requires, not the ability to speak, but the ability to stay silent until it truly matters. She leaned back in her seat, tilting her head slightly toward the window, closing her eyes. Not to sleep, but to think. There's a pain that comes with self-respect. Most people don't realize it. They think restraint means peace, that if you don't fight back, you won't get hurt. But that's not true. Evelyn also, she didn't mind at all. She was simply being measured. There had been many moments like this in her life, moments when she had to decide if speaking up was worth it. And in some of those moments, she stayed silent. Not because she lacked courage, but because she knew the world rarely listened to women like her, unless they were suffering or broken. So she learned how to make her silence more powerful, and today was just like that. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. A new message from Chief Judge Layton. He had forwarded her introduction request. "Don't worry about protocol, it's confidential." She gave a weak smile. That was Layton, straightforward and efficient. She had mentored him back when he was an intern, still wearing cheap ties and doubting every move he made. Now he sat at the top of the federal judiciary. And when Evelyn quietly sent her warning report through internal channels, he acted immediately without a hesitation. She typed a simple reply, "Thank you. No attention needed, just follow through." That was her request. No press, no interviews, no dramatic apologies, just consequences. Consequences that meant something. Up in the cockpit, the captain was quietly speaking with an FAA compliance officer over the headset. Judge Monroe's decision had triggered a code review, a code not to be taken lightly. Only a handful of government positions could ground a flight with a coded message. A federal judge was one of them, especially those presiding over cases involving defense or transportation contractors whose silence carried more weight than any argument. Back in first class, Susan Hartley stood frozen, staring at the small sink, as if it could give her answers. Her hands trembled as she opened a pack of plastic cups, each one clicking softly when she touched it. Emily Carter stepped closer again, this time more cautiously. "They're saying we might not take off right away," she whispered. Susan didn't answer. Emily waited. "Careful," Emily added. "She's not just a passenger, right?" Susan clenched her jaw. "No, she's a federal judge." Emily exhaled slowly. "That explains it. She's not threatening me," Susan said quietly, like she needed to say it out loud. She didn't say a single angry word. Just stood up, just looked at me. A silent move to stop the ship from moving forward. But the pause between them said everything. Some people don't have to shout for things to happen. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who says nothing. Evelyn, a teenager sitting a few rows back, whispered to her mother, What's a federal judge? Her mother leaned in and whispered back, someone who decides really important legal cases, like the highest level. Is she famous? No, her mother said. She has power. That's the difference. Evelyn put her phone away. No more texting. She had done what she needed to do. But inside, something had changed. This wasn't the first time someone assumed she didn't belong here. Not the first time someone asked for her ID twice, or thought she was in the wrong line, or told her to try economy. But this time she'd had enough. Maybe it was age, maybe exhaustion, or maybe the slow buildup of hundreds of small humiliations, none reported but all left scars. So this time she acted without speaking, without explaining, without demanding dignity, because dignity isn't something you beg for. It's something you carry yourself. And sometimes you have to remind people they never have the right to take it away. Across the aisle, the man in seat 2B hadn't said anything more, but he kept stealing shy, heavy glances. He knew what he should do. He knew it the moment it happened. Now he understood. But that moment had passed, and silence held more lasting value than guilt. In the back of the cabin, a child cried for a moment, then quieted down. Evelyn didn't flinch. She closed her eyes again, not from tiredness, but because the wheels were now in motion, and she didn't have to steer them anymore. This wasn't just about her. It was about the next person who might be judged by their coat, their shoes, or their skin. It was about everyone who was quietly pushed aside without fighting back. Because resistance doesn't need a voice. That silent shout had gone further than any scream ever could. And it wasn't over yet. Captain James Darnell sat in the cockpit, hands steady on the yoke eyes shifting between the altitude screen and the plane's comm panel. Outside, the Utah mountains framed the asphalt edge in rugged stillness. But inside, the air was tense with the weight of what had happened and what was about to come. The intercom rang softly again. Another message from the coordination unit. The old gate, FAA observers en route, no taxiing advised. He exhaled slowly, reached for the intercom button, and calmly announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have been ordered to remain at the gate for a short time to perform a technical protocol check. We appreciate your patience." He released the button and sat back. Not exactly a lie, not technically, but it wasn't the full story of what was happening up front. Some passengers looked up, others sighed, used to delays. A businessman in 1D checked his watch and muttered something about missing a connecting flight in Denver, even though this flight didn't go there. But a few passengers glanced toward 2A, toward the woman whose presence somehow stopped the entire plane. Evelyn didn't move or react. She sat still, arms crossed on her lap, seatbelt fastened tight, the way the flight attendant observer walked by. No taxiing. He exhaled slowly, reached for the intercom button, and announced in his calm, neutral voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have been instructed to remain at the gate briefly to perform a technical protocol check. We appreciate your patience." He released the button and sat down. Not lying exactly, not technically, but it was a technical protocol check. There was no time to report. What was happening in the front cabin? Some passengers looked up, others sighed, used to delays. A businessman in 1D checked his watch and muttered something about missing a connecting flight in Denver, even though this flight wasn't going to Denver. But a few passengers glanced toward 2A, toward the woman who had just moved in, back at the person whose presence somehow made the whole plane come to a halt. Evelyn didn't shift or react. She sat still, arms crossed on her lap, seatbelt fastened tight. She didn't need to say anything, she already had. In the galley, Susan Hartley's body went rigid as she heard the captain's voice. She caught just 3 words. "Hold our position." Her stomach twisted. They weren't taking off. Not yet. That didn't just mean someone was watching. It meant someone was intervening. She moved like a robot, grabbed a koi, cup of untouched coffee on the counter, and threw it in the trash. Emily Carter glanced at her, then toward the cockpit door, now closed. "Is it because of her?" she whispered. Emily Carter glanced at her, then looked toward the closed cockpit door. "Is it because of her?" she whispered. Susan didn't answer, but they both understood. On the jet bridge, a new figure approached. A tall black man wearing the FAA's dark blue jacket, clutching a clipboard, Sharp eyes behind clear glasses, his badge identifying him as a supervising officer with messy hair. The FAA's dark blue jacket, clipboard in hand, sharp eyes behind clear glasses, his badge marking him as a supervising officer with messy hair. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Behind him, two airline employees in uniform followed, trying not to show their worry. The cabin door hissed open sharply. Passengers near the front turned around. They weren't sure what they were witnessing, maintenance security, a surprise audit. But the man's FAA jacket and the company staff made it clear. Something unusual was happening. The man stepped slowly onto the plane, surveying the space like a courtroom. When his eyes landed on the first row of seats, he paused and looked at Evelyn Monroe. A courtroom. When his eyes met the first row, he stopped to look at Evelyn Monroe. He didn't nod or acknowledge her directly, but his posture shifted slightly, a signal only a few people in the world could read. And Evelyn saw it immediately. Recognition, respect, protocol. "Good morning, Officer," Hayes said calmly, his voice carrying enough for all first-class passengers to hear. "We have received a regulatory alert for supervised review. All crew members, please remain in place." The lead flight attendant stepped forward. Silence. Susan Hartley felt every molecule in her limbs freeze. Her legs moved before her mind caught up. She stepped out from behind the curtain, clutching her clipboard, as if it could shield her. "I'm Susan Hartley," she said, trying to stay calm. "Ma'am," Officer Hayes replied, expressionless. "Please come with me to the front galley." He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. But every passenger seated from rows 1 to 5 leaned in a little closer. In the galley away from the seats, Hayes lowered his voice, but not too much. "We have received an official red flag under Justice Code 117B, Passenger Monroe, C2A. Susan swallowed hard, but her mouth was dry. Hayes added that he was ordered to move her based on appearance. The confirmation list showed her name assigned to seat 2A. Your boarding pass was scanned properly. Susan opened her mouth. "I'm not here to explain," Hayes said sharply, not raising his voice. "I'm here to take responsibility." He turned to the airline representative behind him. "Under federal regulations, I am declaring this flight non-compliant. The plane will not be allowed to. Permission to taxi is on hold until a statement is made and the crew reassignment is reviewed." The representative went pale. Hayes replied, "You're grounding the crew, not just banning them." The crew. Every situation is shaped by choice. Susan stood still like a statue. In 15 years, she had never felt so completely out of control. Back in seat 2A, Evelyn stayed motionless. She didn't smirk or gloat, but her fingers slowly brushed the edge of her jacket. Once then, she placed her foot into the aisle on the other side. TB stared straight ahead, eyes wide, as if seeing her for the first time. As if this wasn't just a woman reclaiming her seat. Maybe this was someone who could stop time without saying a word. Emily Carter was still in the galley, eyes constantly on Susan and Hayes. Then she did something small but brave. She stepped forward and quietly said, "Sir, I witnessed the relocation. I'm willing to give a statement if needed." She stepped forward and quietly said, "Sir, I witnessed the relocation. I'm willing to give a statement if needed." Hayes looked at her. "What's your name? Who is Emily Carter?" "The young crew." He nodded once. Someone from the old team who could be reached. Susan didn't look at her. Emma hadn't expected her to do that. The officer had left the plane, leaving behind a tense atmosphere with unpredictable consequences. The door closed behind him, but the cabin still didn't breathe easy. A few minutes passed. Then the captain's voice came over again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be delayed for another 20 minutes. Thank you for your patience." It was the voice of a man who knew this flight was no longer in his hands. It was in hers. Evelyn exhaled softly. Her breath came in as the weight hadn't lifted, but the balance had shifted. She didn't have to move the plane. She just had to remind it who was sitting in seat 2M. Susan Hartley had never heard silence sound so loud. The cabin was still except for coughs or the rustle of sleeves. The safety video had long since ended. The flight attendants had nothing left to do, and the passengers weren't reading. They weren't scrolling. They were waiting to take off, but something was landing, and it landed right on Susan. She stood near the front galley's shoulders, tense back against the metal card, eyes staring straight ahead, as if looking through a wall. The plane's door closed again, but this time not to take off. It was to close this moment, and everyone knew it. From the cockpit, the captain's voice came again, brief, polite, but loud enough for anyone paying attention to hear that this was no usual update. Ms. Hartley, please prepare the cabin for an immediate inspection. There it was. Not departure, not arrival, investigation. Susan moved stiffly, stepping back into first class, but she didn't get far. A uniformed airport security officer boarded from the jet bridge. Not TSA, this man wore a jacket with a small silver DOJ pin and an FAA communications badge on his lapel. Behind him was David Larson, a senior executive in the airline's crisis management and customer relations department. The kind of guy who never flies commercial unless something terrible is going on. The sort of man whose appearance says only one thing. This is no longer just a flight issue. This is a responsibility. Larson stepped up. He boarded the plane comfortably, like someone familiar walking into a meeting room after a scandal. Ms. Hartley, he said without asking or waiting. Susan turned toward him and replied, "Yes, sir." He didn't soften his tone. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a review of your conduct." Passengers turned back, heads tilting to the side. This wasn't whispering behind a curtain anymore. "Please gather your personal belongings. You will be escorted off the plane." Susan's lips parted slightly. "Sir, this isn't a discussion," he answered firmly. "You will have a chance to respond officially, but not here, not now." The security officer stepped up beside Larson. "Ma'am," he said, motioning toward the exit. Susan's hands began to tremble. She turned toward the back of the plane as if searching for something. Maybe support from Emily, or for some reason hoping this wouldn't happen. But no one met. Her eyes, not even Emily, no longer. She turned back, trying to stay calm, as if wearing a mask she couldn't hold tight. She took her jacket from the hanger, adjusted it mechanically, and began walking solemnly down the aisle. This time, no clicking heels, only slow, careful footsteps. As she passed the first few rows, some tried to hide their phones, but it was obvious they were recording. Others just stared, unsure whether to look directly or pretend they weren't complicit in the silence. She passed Evelyn Monroe. Their eyes met, and in that look, Susan saw something she had never seen before. Not judgment, not revenge. Compassion. Evelyn didn't smirk or speak. She didn't need to. Some punishments come from the sidelines. Others quietly moved toward the aisle of a parked plane. Susan stepped off. The door closed behind her with a final hiss deeper than the air pressure. It felt like a door closing the version she never realized she needed to leave behind. Inside the plane, the atmosphere shifted again. No longer uncomfortable, but different. The woman in seat 2A was no longer just a passenger. She had become something else, an event, a calculation, and that awareness slowly spread through the cabin like a fog. The man in seat 2B cleared his throat. He had been silent for nearly an hour, but now something inside him couldn't stay quiet any longer. He leaned slightly toward Evelyn. "I should have said this sooner," he muttered. "I saw it. I just didn't think it was my place." Evelyn looked at him. "I understand," she said softly. And yet the silence was always there. He nodded once, shame rising inside him. Further back in economy, a woman nudged her teenage son and whispered, "Do you see?" "Right. That's why you should never judge people by how they look." The boy nodded, eyes wide, watching the ripple of consequences spread through the cabin. Meanwhile, in the galley, Emily Carter took a deep breath. She didn't feel victorious, but she felt relieved. She barely said a word, almost choosing the safer path. But when she saw Susan being escorted away and Evelyn still sitting there quietly with a serious expression, she knew she had done the right thing, and that meant a lot. Evelyn leaned back in her seat. The storm wasn't over yet. There would be interviews, investigations, maybe even media noise, depending on how far this would spread. But now there was nothing more she could do. She had acted, she stayed calm, and the system, at least this time, chose to respond. Outside on the runway, the sun shifted, reflecting off the plane's tail, casting a faint arc of light across the window by seat 2A. Evelyn opened her eyes for a moment. She had seen it. She smiled softly, not because she had won, but because they had seen her, and that was more than most people like her ever got. When the plane finally pushed away from the gate, nearly 2 hours late, the cabin was no longer as quiet as before. The air felt calmer, like a church after confession, still heavy, but with something sacred in it. Calmer, like a church after confession, still heavy, but there was something sacred in the air. Susan Hartley had left, removed and escorted off the flight in front of those she once passed with practiced smiles and stern tones. Now all that was left were the consequences, and then the talking began. In 24D, a middle-aged woman pulled out her phone and started typing. She didn't post often, but this one seemed important. She had just witnessed a black woman being dragged out of first class and then escorted back as if she didn't belong there. An hour later, that woman was still sitting quietly while the airline kicked the flight attendant out of her seat. It turned out she was a federal judge. I'll never forget her face. Calm, steady, no shouting, just present. She added a hashtag she'd never used before. Over in 13B, a young man wearing headphones edited a short clip on his phone, only 15 seconds long. The video showed Susan Hartley walking back down the aisle stiff and pale, escorted by the airline executive and airport security. He didn't add music. He didn't add commentary. He didn't need to. The caption read, "This is what happens when you underestimate a black woman's strength and patience." He lightly tapped to post it. When the video went live, it reached 100,000 views. Even the crew could feel it. Emily Carter now moved down the aisle with a clearer presence. Not louder, not stronger, but more defined. She looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you," like it really meant something. And when she reached the second row, she paused for a moment. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" she asked Evelyn Monroe. Evelyn looked up and replied, "Please, just a glass of water." That was it. Emmeline, she nodded right away, but she didn't leave immediately. She hesitated, then leaned forward a bit, and I saw what happened. I saw it all. Evelyn's eyes met hers. "Thank you," she said. Just 2 words, nothing more. But to Emily, those words felt like a sentence. Somewhere up in the Nebraska sky, the plane hit a bit of turbulence. Nothing serious, just a few shakes to remind everyone they were high above the ground. But the impact wasn't fear, it was movement. His voice calmed down. In row 14, an older white man was talking to the woman beside him. "I've been flying for 40 years. I've never seen a flight stopped for that reason." The younger woman shook her head. "It didn't stop because of that. It stopped because of what it represented." He tilted his head. She added, "That woman was judged before she was welcome. And this time the consequences didn't fall on her. It fell on our." The man looked down, thoughtful. "Reminds me of what happened to my daughter," he muttered. "But she never talked about it like that." "Maybe she didn't think anyone would listen," the woman said, and they sat quietly for a moment. As the drink cart rolled by, a few other passengers pulled out their phones not to scroll, but to share. Some wrote long captions, others posted simple statements. "I witnessed justice happen on Flight 3017. Seat 2A changed how I see silence forever." That woman didn't speak, but she raised the bar. The cabin wasn't just full of people anymore. It was full of witnesses. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat still. She hadn't said much since takeoff. She hadn't opened a book. Her phone was on airplane mode, tucked in, the seat pocket in front of her. She wasn't following the posts, the hashtags, or the swell of attention building behind her like she could feel it. Not his attention, but his pull. What started as humiliation became motivation, and she never left her seat. In seat 2B, the man beside her, quiet conservative, the kind who usually dislikes politics on a plane, shifted again. He glanced at her. "Can I say something?" he asked. Evelyn turned, waiting. "I hesitated earlier," he said. "When she asked to buy your ticket. When she told you to move, I wanted to say something, but I thought maybe you'd be okay. Or maybe I misunderstood." Evelyn listened. He said I was wrong, and I'm sorry. She nodded, then said something he didn't expect. He looked down and added, "You're not the only one who's been silent too long. But what matters is what you do after that silence." As the plane began its descent over Chicago airspace, flight attendants efficiently performed their final checks. The cabin grew noisy, not from last-minute rustling or impatient seat shifting, but from a shared awareness. Everyone sat up straight. Everyone remembered their seat. In the cockpit, the captain received another message before reaching the target. It wasn't from the airline. It was a priority alert from the FAA's Judicial Feedback Channel, a report on passenger Monroe Evelyn priority observation. He said nothing. He didn't have to. He just glanced at the first officer and said, eyes sharp for landing. This one's important. Back in seat 2A, Evelyn looked out the window. Chicago's skyline cut through a thin layer of clouds. The city looked familiar, but also new, as if something had changed even if it hadn't moved physically. She knew what awaited on the ground wouldn't be chaos. It would be a conversation, one that wouldn't start with a press release, but with the passengers who had witnessed what happened. And this time they wouldn't forget. Not her, not this, not seat 2A. The plane had landed at O'Hare Airport nearly 40 minutes ago, but Judge Evelyn Monroe still hadn't left her seat. Nearly 40 minutes earlier, but Judge Evelyn Monroe remained seated. She sat in seat 2A, back straight, her jacket folded neatly on her lap. The seatbelt sign was off. The seat in front of her was still upright, but she didn't move. Not because she was waiting, but because others were waiting. Outside the plane, but these people were silent, dressed in Navy uniforms, wearing name badges with the posture that said, "We were asked to show up. Now we're figuring out why." We were asked to show up. Now we're figuring out why. Among them were two representatives from the Department of Transportation, an aide to a state senator, and a senior liaison from the Airline's Public Relations Department. Behind them, a press aide from the Judicial Accountability Committee whispered into her earpiece, occasionally jotting notes in a notebook. They all shared one thing in common. None of them were prepared for this, because no one expected a widespread reckoning to happen mid-flight, especially when it started without a shout. This story had unfolded less than 2 hours ago. The clip captured Sat 2A became a trend not just in the US, but also in the UK and Canada. The comment threads filled with veterans, government officials, and former airline staff. I served 22 years in the Air Force. I know exactly what that woman went through. It's shameful. And she stayed calm. I teach law. This case will be in my curriculum next semester. Then came the one line no PR team could save. She didn't even speak up. The world raised that for her. Inside the terminal, a woman in a sun-baked brown suit handed her phone to it could be saved. She didn't even speak up. The world elevated that for her. Inside the terminal, a sun-browned woman in a brown suit handed her phone to a colleague. "You know who she is, right?" she whispered. "Federal Judge Evelyn Monroe. She's overseeing the fraud case at Simmons Securities, the one involving a contractor bribery network." Katie blinked. "That Monroe?" "That's right, Monroe." Silence. "So someone's going to get fired." "No," the woman corrected. "Someone's being audited." Meanwhile, at the airline's executive office in Chicago, CEO Matthew Kleen watched the news intently on the plasma screen. His phone buzzed every 10 seconds. Legal press board members, government relations. Everyone had an opinion, but only one person had the authority, and she was still sitting in seat 2A. He turned to the head of communications. "What do we have? Draft an apology, don't name her, broadly acknowledge the incident, and suggest an internal review." Matthew frowned. "Too vague." "Yes, sir." "Trash it." "Start over." The room fell silent. He continued. "We're not handling a PR issue. We're dealing with a federal employee being delayed during a legal process. She claims she was removed due to discrimination, but we don't know if this technically counts as discrimination," the legal counsel said cautiously. Matthew glanced at him. "She had a valid seat, was kicked off the plane because of her appearance. And we have crew members admitting that. This isn't a technicality." "That's textbook," he said, looking back at the screen. A still photo of Evelyn sitting quietly, jacket on her lap, eyes staring straight ahead. Callie said, "We need more than an apology." Back on the plane, Evelyn's phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from a phone number not in the Federal District Court's 7th Circuit Clerk's Office contact list. "We've been informed that the FAA has escalated this to the Congressional Subcommittee. No comment. We support you." She locked the screen. A moment later, the curtain opened. David Larson, the man who fired Susan Hartley, entered the first-class cabin. He moved slowly and carefully. "Judge Monroe," he said in a low voice, "we're ready to escort you out now if you wish. Security is guarding the area. There are some press nearby, but we've arranged a private flight if you want." Evelyn measured him with her eyes. "Is she still working?" Larson hesitated. "Suspended pending investigation." "That's not an answer." She replied. He shifted slightly. She won't board another flight until the investigation is complete. That's all I can guarantee for today. Evelyn nodded once. That was enough now. She stood up. Larson stepped back, giving her space. Not just physically, but socially, as if he knew this was no longer about airline protocol. This was about the organization's respect. The walk down the jet bridge was silent. No cameras, no flashes. But outside the gate, the presence of a story was undeniable. Passengers from other flights stopped. Some turned back, some stared, and somewhere near the center of the terminal, a reporter whispered into a lapel mic. She's coming. The judge is stepping out. Yes, it's her. Beneline didn't slow down, didn't hide her face. She smiled. She wasn't stepping out as a victim. She wasn't stepping out as a hero. She was stepping out simply as herself, going out as herself. The woman boarded the plane silent and confident, holding a ticket that should have been enough. A child watched her pass by and tugged on her mother's sleeve. Is she famous? The mother thought for a moment and then replied, No, honey, she's important. Outside the gate, a press assistant from the Department of Transportation hit send on a statement titled Dignity in Travel, calling it an unacceptable incident. The organization's response was vague, but it wasn't silence. Sometimes in moments like this, even vagueness is better than nothing at all. At a cafe in Washington, D.C., an assistant to a newly elected congresswoman was drafting a memo about the legislative investigation. Should gate agents and crew be required to undergo bias recognition training? In a federal employee group chat, someone shared a link and wrote, She never raised her voice, and they still heard her. In room 2A, now empty, only a folded napkin and a presence mark remained a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't come with a siren's wail. It comes with posture and silence carrying a name with it. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of a ceiling fan and the gentle clink of a spoon stirring tea. Evelyn Monroe sat at her father's dining table, still wearing the outfit from Flight 317. Her jacket was folded neatly over the chair, back her heels left by the door. She hadn't changed yet, not because she was too tired, but because something inside her still hovered, as if the flight hadn't truly ended. Across from her sat Judge Robert Monroe, a retired senior court judge with his reading glasses perched halfway down his nose and a thin stack of papers open before him. He wasn't reading. Not really. He was watching her. You haven't said much yet. He finally said, his voice low and gravelly, both wise and warning. I didn't have to, she replied. He nodded. She didn't mean it that way. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, warm tea in hand. She said simply that it happened. Everyone saw it. They reacted. And now it was headline news. Her father folded the papers tightly. The headline didn't reflect justice. No, she agreed. But it was fuel. He watched her carefully. You didn't call me when it happened. She gave a weak smile. You taught me not to. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I taught you to be precise. I didn't teach you to carry the whole world on your shoulders alone. Evelyn looked at him. You raised me to be the room, not just to wait to be welcomed inside it. And that's exactly what you did, he said. But I know that look. You're carrying more than just a story. Boarding a plane with a valid ticket only to be told there's no seat for you. Knowing that if I raised my voice even an octave, the story would be about my behavior. Knowing if I raised my voice even an octave, the story would be about my behavior, not her judgment. Her father didn't interrupt. And the worst part, she continued, is that none of this surprised me. There was a pause long enough for the old grandfather clock in the corner to chime a full minute. Then he said, You were right to not yell. I'm not trying to prove I'm right, she replied. I just didn't want to give them a headline they could twist. He nodded. But what you gave them? They're better off, he said. You gave them a mirror. Evelyn looked down at her hands, steady but tired. I keep thinking about the women who, they were asked to move, but no one showed up to help. No officers, no executives, no trending hashtags, just humiliation and silence. Robert leaned forward. Do you know what the real fear is for people like flight attendants? What that kind of power can wear a face they don't expect. That discipline can speak in a woman's voice. That dignity can show up in a gray jacket and shoes without them realizing it. Evelyn smiled softly. You always liked a poetic ending. He smiled back. I'm old now. I've earned that right. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a printed memo. The FEOA has stamped an update on the internal investigation, timeline, administrative hold, possible termination. He handed it to her. They'll give you a written apology, he said, and they want to know if you consider meeting privately with the airline management. Evelyn took the paper but didn't read it right away. I'm not interested in a handshake behind closed doors. I thought so, he said. She glanced at the memo and folded it neatly. But I care about change. He nodded slowly. Are you thinking about a lawsuit? She shook her head. No, I want to know the policy process. Verify mandatory ticket checks before removal bias. Protocol training, clear channels for passengers to report discrimination without being labeled troublemakers. He tapped the table once in agreement. And I want that public, she added. I want it recorded, voted on, and passed not just at this airline, but across the industry. Her father looked impressed. You want not just resolution, but infrastructure. Exactly. They sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked, did you ever go through anything like this when you wore your robe? He chuckled softly. Kid, I asked the judge to check my records carefully in the courtroom. I had staff call security when I entered the wrong court door. Once a defendant's lawyer asked if I was a court reporter, Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Seriously? He nodded. Seriously. I was 35 wearing a robe with a judge's nameplate. Monroe. But I still didn't fit their image. Did you report it? No, he said, but I remember it. Then he added, you didn't report yours either. He added, I want it recorded, voted on, and passed not just in this airline, but across the whole industry. Her father looked very impressed. You don't just want a resolution, you want infrastructure. Exactly. They sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked, did you ever go through anything like this when you were still wearing the robe? He chuckled quietly. Kid, I asked the judge to review my files carefully. In the courtroom. I asked the staff to call security when I walked into the wrong courtroom. Once the defendant's lawyer asked if I was a court reporter, Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Seriously? He nodded. Seriously, I was 35 wearing a robe with a nameplate that said Judge Monroe. But I still didn't fit their image. Did you report it? No, he said, but I remember it. Then he added, you didn't report it either. Not exactly. She raised her phone. I didn't have to. The system reported itself. They smiled together. Bittersweet. 2 generations. A judge. 2 different eras. The same story. Except this time the audience was listening. Then as Evelyn stood by the window looking out at the Chicago skyline, her father quietly came up and placed a hand on her shoulder. You know they're going to ask you to speak. I know, Dittman said. They want a statement. TV panels, conferences, and the press will cover it in a dozen ways. She turned slightly toward him. I won't let them reduce it to sound bites. He nodded once. But I will speak, she said, his eyebrows raised. Not just for me, but for all the women who sat in seat 2A and couldn't go home with their dignity intact. Outside, the city lights blinked unaware. But inside that apartment, something settled. A plan with purpose and a promise not to let this story fade away like just another trending news topic. A purpose and promise not to let this story disappear into the news cycle as just another trending topic. Evelyn Monroe was not demanding justice. She was shaping policy and making decisions all at once. The hall was modest. No grand marble columns, no chandeliers, just folding chairs, a small wooden podium, and an American flag standing quietly in the corner. But the room was full. Veterans in crisply pressed uniforms, community leaders in casual business attire, and journalists with recorders on their laps. In the front row, 2 elderly women sat shoulder to shoulder holding hands. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. Finally, something meaningful was about to be spoken. Judge Evelyn Monroe stood behind the curtain, her hands relaxed at her sides, shoulders straight. She wasn't wearing a robe or formal attire, just a navy blazer, a white blouse, and a soft gray scarf tucked into her collar. She didn't need to show power. She was powerful. The event was hosted by a local veterans advocacy group, but the topic had quickly expanded beyond military service. The event began with a quiet invitation to speak that turned into a nationally streamed event. The story of Flight 3117 had reached Capitol Hill, and now even C-SPAN was covering it. But Evelyn didn't care about the cameras. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She came to set the record straight. The organizer gently patted her shoulder. "They're ready for you, ma'am." She nodded once and stepped onto the stage. The applause was soft at first, respectful and hesitant. People weren't sure how loudly to cheer for someone who never wanted attention but had captured the nation's focus. But as she stepped up to the podium, the room erupted. She stood silently as the last hands clapped. Then she placed a sheet of paper on the lectern. She didn't look down. She looked out and began, "I'm not here to talk about airline policy. I'm not here to shame an employee or punish a company. I'm not here to chase a trend. And I don't need validation from strangers. What I want is to say what I couldn't say in seat 2A. I stayed silent because I had to. Because if I spoke louder, the story might focus on my anger instead of what actually happened. And what? It happened so simply. I was judged before I was welcomed. So to prove myself before being shown kindness. I felt emotional not because I caused trouble, but because I was deemed unworthy. It wasn't disrespect, but because someone thought I wasn't capable." She let the silence hang there, unhurried, not overwhelming. Then she continued, her voice calm and deliberate. "That assumption has followed me my whole life. Through school, through the law, and through every courtroom I ever stepped into. It showed up in many forms. Are you clergy? Are you lost? Is your husband a judge? But this time it happened 30,000 feet in the air. And this time someone witnessed it happen. This time I didn't have to write it down in the footnotes of a memoir. 20 years later, this time the silence was broken. Everyone leaned forward. No phones were picked up. No one wanted to miss a word. I spent my whole career making decisions. But that day I made a choice. Not to shout, not to explain to someone who had already decided. I decided to let my name carry its own weight. I chose silence and a system of accountability, not because I demanded it, but because it had to be that way. That tells you something, right? Systems can work, but they only work when someone's watching." She looked around the room, then paused again. "I'm not here to celebrate a victory. There are no winners in moments like these, only clarity. I'm not speaking for applause. I speak because I understand the feeling of being invisible while sitting in plain sight. And now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it." A quiet wave spread through the room. "This isn't okay. How insightful." "So what happens next?" she asked. "Policy. I submitted a proposal to the Department of Transportation, including mandatory bias training for the entire crew, proper ticket verification, before reassignment, and a real-time reporting system for passengers who face discrimination. Not after the flight. No more polite apologies. No more reassignment without accountability. We're no longer pretending misunderstandings are harmless." She lifted the paper, but didn't read it aloud, only circled her rubber-stamped hand. "Some might say I'm exaggerating when I say this was just a flight, just a seat. But ask yourself, how many times has that happened without cameras, without rank badges, without titles to lean on? I don't want to be the exception that proves the rule. I want to help rewrite the rules." That's when the applause started. Not to show off, but to show determination. Evelyn stepped back from the podium, nodded gently, and walked off the stage without waiting for praise. Behind the curtain, the assistant who had greeted her earlier now looked stunned. "You didn't use a teleprompter?" Evelyn smiled. "No need." For one, backstage a reporter quietly approached her. "Judge Monroe, can you spare a minute for a quick quote?" Evelyn considered it. Then she leaned in and said softly, "I'm not here for quotes. I'm here to be heard." That night, the speech aired on every major news channel. A short clip went viral with headlines like, "Judd, the quiet woman in seat 2A, has finally spoken up for a whole nation. Silence is strength. The woman who changed airline policy," without raising her voice. But Evelyn didn't watch the news. She reviewed the policy draft again and worked with legal advisors and responded to emails from federal transportation offices. At a small cafe in Memphis, a retired teacher named Margaret Ellis watched the entire speech on her phone, tears quietly streaming down her cheeks. She whispered, "That's exactly what it looks like. When someone not only receives justice but becomes justice itself." If this story resonates with you, if you've ever sat in a seat you paid for and still felt unseen, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us, have you ever felt like you didn't belong, even when you did everything right? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it today. And if you believe in justice, justice doesn't have to be loud to be strong. Subscribe and follow us. Thank you for joining Evelyn's journey. Seat 2A may be quiet, but its echo still spreads.